So I wanted to begin, and also great to see so many of my students and colleagues, including from some faraway places. Thank you very much for coming. I wanted to start with this image of a merchant family. Look at the furnishings. They're in the shadows, deliberately obscured. But this image conveys the opulence of what we think of as a bygone era. This is a widow of a large merchant clan in the Volga region of Samara. Samara city was considered to be the Chicago on the Volga, late 19th century, early 20th century, Russia before the revolution. Booming town, and merchants kind of epitomize the modern face of the city. When we look at images like this, we think this is a world disappeared in the furnaces of the Bolshevik Revolution. And I'm going to debunk and kind of systematically challenge this. Not only that, I'm going to try to convince you and make a case for linking the non-destruction of this old society to the social support for autocracy now, and indeed challenge to autocracy in Putin's Russia. And also perhaps grapple with the questions of non-mobilization or very weak response that we see now of Russian citizens to this aggression, Russia's war against Ukraine. So the argument I'm going to make in a nutshell is very provocative indeed, and it sounds very simplistic, but hopefully some of the evidence that I will present will convince you that I'm making a case that for perhaps a reconsideration of how we approach the Russian society and the Soviet legacies. So I consider Russian society as a bimodal one, in that historically Russia has had a small layer of educated intelligentsia with intergenerationally reproduced privilege, going back all the way to the Tsarist times and going back to the privileged citizens of Tsarist Russia, and a very, very large group of historically underprivileged citizens deprived of major rights, and that is the mostly rural peasant society. What is controversial about what I'm arguing is that, contrary to Bolshevik propaganda, this kind of bimodality never disappeared in Russian society, and it really helps us make sense of the kind of social divisions we see now and support or challenge to autocracy. And this is somewhat less controversial, but this is something that features in two absolutely brilliant books. By the way, Mark Beisinger, I'm very excited, is coming to speak at LSE in February. I'm hosting and chairing that talk. Do make a note. He's going to be talking about his brilliant book, but he shows in analyzing protest dynamics across the globe in the 20th century and how they evolved. He writes that it's mostly an urban phenomenon, and education and exposure to information matters. So that doesn't sound very controversial, but I'm going to link this kind of aspect of information and education to our understandings of Russian society. And also we have a brilliant book by Guriev and Treisman and we discussed it in class this morning with my students, which talks about how modern day autocrats use spin, propaganda, and those kind of soft techniques of manipulating public opinion rather than resorting to so much to violence and repression as they did in the kind of, when we think of 20th century brutal Stalinist type dictatorships. But again, in their analysis, information matters. And when the public is poorly educated and uninformed, autocrats can get away with spin and manipulation. So they do say that, challenges to autocracy come from educated, well-connected, and well-informed citizens who can scrutinize spin and information. I wanted to give a kind of a little advert to a special issue of post-Soviet affairs, and Gulnaz also has a paper there, where we debate what is it that we got wrong about in terms of how we understand Russian politics and society, and why are we struggling now to make sense of apparent passivity of the Russian public in the face of this brutal war, and apparent passivity in the face of conscription, Russian or consolidating autocracy. So we're debating some of these issues, and in my own contribution, I draw my book to say that what we have been missing in Russian studies is historical, deep sociological work that is deeply contextualized, right? And Professor Sirotudinova here, her book, Red Mirror, is very historical, very context-rich, and also helps us grapple with this question. So there are some recent works which I also draw on. So the big divide I'll be talking about is between, and I have here two images which kind of capture these divisions in Russian society, which are historical and have been there for a long time. And on this one, on the first image, you see journalists from a trendy news outlet, TV Rain, which is an opposition outlet, and it's been broadcasting critical news about the war. It's a very liberal channel, really has been a source of information about the autocracy and of independent news. Now they're broadcasting from exile since the war. They have been labeled as foreign agent, the journalists working there. And on the other hand, we have this image of a society, of a large mass of apparently cheering for autocracy. And I use the word apparently because guess what? Public opinion surveys have become unreliable. We really don't know what % of Russian population actually support the war, actually support autocracy. But on the face of it, we have this large mass of people as captured in this image cheering for Putin, for autocracy, and indeed for the war. So the arguments I'm going to present about the kind of historical nature of this deep divide are very controversial, and those of you who want to interrogate the data underpinning the analysis could look at the American Political Science Review paper, which I co-authored with Alexander Liebman. It's got a massive data appendix where if you look at historical data to trace this continuity in the reproduction of Russian society and social structure from before the revolution through communism and to the present. And of course, also my book, which has a lot of kind of deep historical archival and other information. I have a website as well, which discusses the book specifically, and I've published short blogs like the Broad Street blog, which contains really in a nutshell. If you don't want to read the entire book, there is in a nutshell there. So how did we get it so wrong? And I think we did get it wrong when it comes to our misconceptions about Soviet society as a clean break from the Tsarist past. Well, in a stylized way, I ascribe it to three factors. One is, of course, Soviet propaganda, which is not surprising, should not be surprising now, considering what we know about Russian spin. We know that Putin uses the same techniques of the Soviet dictatorships of the past, of misinformation, especially when it comes to public opinion abroad. The Soviet Union was really masterful in convincing the world, and especially left-leaning intellectuals who welcomed the Bolshevik Revolution abroad in Europe and America, and who kind of picked up and ran with this narrative of the Soviet communism and being a new civilization, as we know from the work of Sidney and Beatrice Webb, who were the co-founders of the London School of Economics, Fabian socialists, who wrote a book. And if you read that book, you will see how they basically used a lot of Soviet period statistics and ran with them without used them at face value, without scrutinizing the kind of information they were presented from Soviet official sources. So they published the next edition of their book without a question mark in the affirmative, suggesting that Soviet communism is indeed a new civilization. There were, of course, other works like those by Sheila Fitzpatrick, the prominent historian, who also wrote about phenomenal social mobility, especially when it comes to the working class and the rural groups, which I also question in my book. And then, of course, most recently, we have books like the one by Thomas Piketty. There's also historian Walter Scheidel, who write about revolutions and wars as the so-called great leveler. They write about great calamities and catastrophes like the revolution and wars of all kinds, like 20th century wars, as having an equalizing effect on society, which is of course true if we take the material dimension, right? But their material dimension of equality or inequality is only one part of the story. We're missing the whole layer of other kinds of capitals: human capital, cultural capital, social capital, education, that doesn't disappear even if an individual loses all their material possessions. So people like Piketty and Scheidel, when they talk about the leveling effects of these calamities, they don't really discuss the other aspects of the other capitals that can be reproduced despite these calamities. So at the heart of the argument I'm making is a discussion about a neglected institution, and it was an institution because it so deeply permeated all aspects of imperial, the Tsarist Russian society. Tsarist society and state divided social groups according to rigid criteria, mostly ascribing them by birth, with peasants at the very bottom. And when I say it was an institution, it really was, because people would have your estate written into your passports, into your marriage documents, into your wills. So if you're born into the peasant estate, you will have it everywhere in your document. The vast majority of citizens on the eve of the revolution, almost 80%, were in the peasant estate. Then there were the urban groups of Mishani, the largest group after peasant, but we know very little about them. 10%, these were essentially the urban bourgeoisie, and then a small layer of merchants, phenomenally rich people who could move from Mishani to the merchant estate if they could buy gilt certificates. Then there was the tiny group of clergy. And when we say clergy, we imagine priests in robes. This is a misleading picture. On the eve of the revolution, many people from the clergy were rapidly moving into the professions. Even if you still had clergyman or woman in your papers because you were born into the clergyman's family, many of them were rapidly becoming professionals in a modern sense of the word: medics, doctors, especially veterinarians. These are classic middle-class sort of professions. This is an untold story about how the educated layers of society became the kind of modern professional middle class. And of course, the nobility. That included the hereditary aristocracy and the so-called personal nobles. Personal nobles were those who could enter the noble estate through service, and there was a very rigid layer, a rigid ladder of progression, the table of ranks that dates back to the Peter the Great's reforms, the Petrine reforms. So in my work, I conceptualize these three groups above as the so-called educated estates. Why? Because they were extremely far more literate than the peasants' estate, and I will show you some statistics. And it is these groups that joined the modern professions already before the revolution, and they continued in the modern professions thereafter. This is the so-called Soviet middle class, overwhelmingly derived from the urban bourgeoisie, the aristocracy, and the clergy. Right? The peasants, they move into the sort of blue-collar factory work in the cities or are trapped in collective farms. But in my analysis, estates are not just important in terms of how these groups related to each other, because there was a big divide between the so-called narod, the people, mostly peasants, and the rest of society, especially, the aristocrats and the peasants, but also those other groups that distinguish themselves from the peasant narod. But the estate structure also matters. If we look at civil society and the public sphere, that was very thriving in some ways, even in provincial cities before the revolution. And again, here I'm kind of puncturing another myth about Imperial Russian society on the eve of the revolution, that it lacked, that it was underdeveloped, that it was backward. There was very little kind of democratic impulse there. There was, and in my book, it's epitomized by people like Antonina Hardina, a noble woman who founded a gymnasium, a private school for girls. These gymnasia were were hubs of civic activism. And she was, by the way, the daughter of a prominent jurist, and Vladimir Lenin worked when he was young with this man, Hardina's father, in the city of Samara in his youth, in his law office. So you had people like this, and they were running a very, and I don't think we'll be able to discern everything. You could read my book, but basically I show these concentric circles of the public sphere. That is the sphere between this society, which is very stratified and has the form of a ladder, and on the other hand, the top, which is the layer of institutions that was decimated after the Bolsheviks came to power. So we know the monarchy was gone. We know that many in the police and the gendarme forces were repressed, and that institution was decimated. But what do we know about the public sphere, the civil society, the schools, the professions, the museums, the art galleries? We know very little about those intermediate layer that contributed to a thriving civic and public sphere on the eve of the Bolshevik Revolution, and was not decimated. And it was incredibly well connected. As I show in this social network analysis, I don't expect you to understand the kind of intricacies thereof. And even I have trouble sometimes discerning this stuff. My PhD students, brilliant PhD students, help me do this analysis. All you need to understand is when you see like a circle that seems to be a circle in itself like this, it means this organization is very poorly connected to the rest of society in Samara city in 1916, the year before the revolution. When we see like that pink circle there with lots of lines towards other circles, that means it's really well connected. And that's the Hardina Gymnasium for girls, which, you know, people who worked there sat on all kinds of charities and civic bodies and were well connected with the city Duma. This is the local council. Even the banks were a little bit more connected than, for instance, the police or the railway services. So we see that some organizations are very well connected. Why is the story of connectedness of the bourgeoisie and aristocracy and clergy so important? It's important because we know from theorists who have done social network analysis that being connected actually helps you in life. It helps you get on when it comes to getting a job. You know that those of you who are applying for jobs, that, you know, getting recommendations, knowing people is always a good thing. So these people, the bourgeoisie and aristocrats, were incredibly well connected to each other. Many were intermarried. They sat on same charity boards, civil society organizations, and whatnot. And I argue that it helped them survive after the revolution when the witch hunts were raging against them. What other evidence do we have supporting the narrative of social reproduction of the educated layers of Russian Tsarist society? We can also work with this archival sources, and I was lucky to serendipitously come across a phenomenally rich archive of the merchant Konstantin Niklutin and his wife Polya, who escaped the Bolshevik Revolution, fought with the whites, and escaped with their infant son Vadim. They helped the Kolchak forces. They escaped via Harbin in China to the United States. But most family members, and that was a very large family, over 30 people I counted, who stayed in Russia. So they were sending letters and packages to their relatives in Russia, and those relatives were writing back to them. So we have letters about what was happening with those people, the bourgeoisie that stayed in Samara in the 1920s, in the 1930s, and the 1940s, including when the terror raged. So we have a kind of detailed, almost ethnographic account about how the merchants adapted. If there are some Russians here in the audience, you will know that many of you, after especially people in my generation, perhaps not the younger ones, but you will know that after the Soviet Union collapsed, many people became obsessed interested, if not really obsessed with, establishing their pre-revolutionary ancestry. And they literally started opening up closets, trying to find out who was my great-grandfather. Was he a worker at the furnace, as his paper said, or was he, after all, a priest in the church, or like a small bourgeois, like my great-grandfather, who ran a little village shop, you know? So they started open, and we find out, and these are records from, this record is from somebody who's currently a professor at Samara University, a historian. Her ancestors who were in that kind of petite bourgeoisie, and then this is these are the ancestors of a young man who is doing rocket science PhD. So very highly educated people, professor, they're descendants of this bourgeoisie. So this man's grandfather was a great-grandfather rather, was of clergy estate, we believe, but who became a veterinarian. So very typical trajectory for the clergy. So the way I posed the question is, we all know what happened to Nicholas and Alexandra and their children after the revolution, but what do we know about the proprietor of a hair salon, provincial hair salon, or the provincial veterinarian? What happened to those people after the revolution? But we should concern ourselves with this question, because all we know from these big debates about the role of the bourgeoisie in supporting democracy, etc., is that it matters, right? And this is the quintessential, perhaps petite, of a smaller, more modest variety, but it is the bourgeoisie, and we think it disappeared in the furnaces of the revolution. So I trace the kind of intergenerational adaptation trajectory of different groups of people, depending on where they were positioned in Tsarist society. So in this part of the work is sociological, and then I link their fortunes to bigger questions about support for democracy, possibilities they have in, or rather their descendants have in Russia's post-communist state. So on one image, you see Vera Goimster, who is a highly decorated archaeologist and historian of Swedish origin, already very prominent before the revolution. We know that she basically smoothly transitioned into the same profession after the revolution. She remained an archaeologist, worked in highly elite establishment. She died in blockade Leningrad of starvation, very sadly, but she was not repressed. So many of such individuals did suffer repression, but many were not repressed. So she personifies one trajectory of adaptation via the cultural institutions of Soviet Russia. On the other side, we see somebody who embodies another trajectory. This was a highly decorated medic, I believe of noble origin, a Pole, Evgeny Leopoldovich Kovetsky. All these people are from Samara, by the way. I mostly look at one region to establish their connections and life trajectories. He was extremely decorated before the revolution. He continued to be a very prominent physician in the elite layers of the medical profession in Soviet Samara. His two sons continued in a dynastic sense in that kind of professional trajectory, becoming prominent physicians and cancer specialists in one of them in Kiev, running an prestigious oncological institute in Ukraine, in Soviet Ukraine. And then we have here Olenka Konovalova. She is the grandmother of somebody who is also now a professor at Samara University. She was born in 1900 or 1901, but in 1917, when the Bolshevik Revolution struck, she was just finishing high school. In a way, she was born at the right time and at the right place, because she, unlike the vast majority of citizens, she actually had high school education. Let's not forget that at the time, only a tiny proportion of Russian citizens had even a high school education, not to mention university. So although not having a university degree, she entered the revolutionary period with credentials far superior to those of the peasant mass. And this was extremely important when we talk about the Soviet Union's modernization agenda. Let's look at the literacy statistics. We see that on the eve of the revolution, the aristocracy in Russia, nobility, broadly the noble estate, was 90% literate. We look at the statistics for clergy, even higher. Clergy was actually habitually educated the state, much like it has been in other parts of the world. In India, for instance, the Brahmin estate, because they have to work with books and, traditionally these are considered to be learned groups. So very high literacy of the clergy estate according to the census the information that we have and other data, 95%. And then the urban estate, the merchants and Mishani, 64% lower, but still significantly higher if you look at the statistics for peasant literacy. So less than 1/3 were, or around 1/3 only were literacy. So what implications does it have for trying to establish the social mobility trajectories of these various groups? Wouldn't many of us contend that Stalin rapidly accelerated the process of, and Lenin, of course, of modernization, of lifting people out of poverty and illiteracy? Well, let's look at some of the statistics. In 1937, Stalin, in good faith, held a census. And the results of that census astonished him so much that he sacked and repressed and executed some of the census takes. And the results of this census was shelved. And only because some historians discovered these secret records of some census data tables that were not destroyed, some aggregators, we have a picture of why Stalin was so aghast from what he saw. What he saw was essentially, in 1937, Soviet society largely remained a mirror of Tsarist society. Protestants remained highly literate. By the way, there were questions about religion and questions about where do you derive your money. So many, it turns out, continued to be rentier. That is, they rented out their properties, and that's how they devised their obtained income. Many people, in other words, continued to engage in private enterprise secretly and maybe in an underground way, but that was the reality. And also it was a highly illiterate society. So Stalin proclaimed that Russia was on the verge of, and the Soviet Union was on the verge of becoming a fully educated society, but these were bogus statistics because let's look at women aged 40 to 44%. Age 40 to 44, close to 50%, and 83% of those aged 60 to 64 were illiterate. So imagine if you're a mother transmitting knowledge to your children, an illiterate mother, as we know from various studies of education and intergenerational transmission, an illiterate mother is not going to transmit the same kind of education to her child as Olenka Konovalova did to her grandson, who became a professor at Samara University. What did Olenka Konovalova do? She taught her grandson French. They held little at-home tuition circles. She taught her grandson to play the piano. Classical music was played in the home. This is the kind of cultivation that was present in the families of the bourgeoisie and aristocracy well through the Soviet period. So I promised I will attach some concepts to the faces of the people I showed you, the Swedish-born archaeologist, the Polish medic, by the way, many of the many of the educated layers and highly engaged citizens in Tsarist society were European or Europeanized in terms of their exposure, education, etc. So I conceptualized the three roots of social reproduction in Soviet period as the organization man route, and Kavietsky, the medic, very much embodies it because we see actually from, if we look at the hierarchies of the medical institution, we see that people like Kavietsky, who were already highly placed before the revolution as consultants, as medical scientists, they continued in those roles. People who were more often from the peasant milieu remained in the status of nurses. So these hierarchies organizationally were reproduced, and the professions were absorbed into the Soviet professional sort of institutions pretty much en masse. Why? Because the Bolsheviks were desperate to promote modernization and live up to their grand objectives, grand proclamations. Then there is the so-called museum society. This type note is from an informant in the 1920s who was spying on the educated bourgeoisie and merchants and aristocrats who were congregating around this Vera Goldston, the archaeologist who really helped safeguard the jobs and positions of these people, despite the witch hunts that were raging against so-called class enemies at the time. So from these informers reports, we have a kind of micro-sociology about how people, these networks of the bourgeoisie, the formerly privileged group, were able to protect each other and to kind of reproduce their status in Soviet society. And then there is what I call the pop-up brigade. These are people like Olenka Konovalova, many of them girls and boys, young men and women just out of high school. They didn't have a formal profession yet because they were simply too young, but they were far more educated and literate than the vast majority of Russian and Soviet citizens. And so they joined, the Soviet regime engaged them in various agitprop and kultprop, all that stuff, all those events of going to factories, and other places of work and promoting culture, teaching literacy and whatnot. So I call them the pop-up brigade because they were not as professionalized and not as organizationally structured as people who were in the, for instance, what I call the organization man society. What we also know is, and I did talk about the intangible capitals that are so important when we think about reproduction of social status. We talk about values. And when many of us, when we read about the Bolshevik Revolution, right, we assume that people were decimated and really kind of lost their status because they lost their material possessions. We know that the aristocracy lost everything, and their palaces and mansions and whatnot. What we don't think about is how these people actually, what is it that they valued? Did they value those material possessions over other things? What I find when I read letters of merchants is they were actually obsessed about education. And the real anger and frustration comes when their son or daughter is denied a place in a prestigious university like King's or like LSE, and they get very, very angry and wound up, right? So the fact that they lost material possessions, they come to live with that and accept that. They will never accept the loss of education status. They were absolutely obsessed with retaining it. So in those letters that I read of the merchants, and these are, by the way, pictures from the gymnasium high school this is Polya, Constantine's wife, the man who emigrated to America. They use the word sluzba, service. Obsessively, they describe how their children have finished a college degree and that they are now serving. The word sluzba actually captures white-collar occupation. They were so really preoccupied with keeping this status in a semantic sense, telling their relatives, assuring them that their sons and daughters are sluzhat, that they're serving, they're not doing rabota. Rabota, Russian word for work. And then another word they like is delo. Delo is business. If you know Russian, you know delavoy means business. So that's how, so I make this distinction in my book. It comes very clearly from so they were obsessed with retaining education. Does material aspect not matter at all? Is it completely irrelevant? Well, it's not completely irrelevant because the information we also have is this kind of paradoxical situation when, on the one hand, the Bolshevik state was, with one hand, repressing these so-called former people, the bourgeoisie, the aristocracy, but on the other hand, it was facilitating the material transfers from abroad to these same people in the form of remittances and packages. Why was the Soviet Union doing this paradoxical policy? Well, there's a fantastic book by Elena Osokina, who's a Russian historian. She writes about these processes, and she writes about how the Soviet Union very quickly ran out of the gold reserves, the imperial, so it ran out of reserves and it needed foreign currency. It needed these infusions of kind of external currency to sustain its modernization and industrialization agenda. So it actually encouraged people, relatives of these people who stayed in Russia, their relatives who move up to America or Europe, to send transfers in US dollars or in, in European currency. And so what we find is these sums actually were non-trivial. So if any of you who has a grandmother in Russia now will know that the amounts we're talking about, like for instance, monthly remittance transfer from Constantine to his grandmother, to his mother, sorry, who died in 1930, amounted to more than $437. And that's a historical conversion I did even before the war. Now it's probably more, but that's higher than the state pension in Russia. So remittances that he sent, and there was probably more, amounted over the several years to more than 26,000 US dollars to just this one matriarch, his mother. So it's really non-trivial amounts when we think about kind of the modern day equivalent of these remittances that were going in. What were these people using these remittances for? They were using them to pay for school fees. Many of us don't realize that the Bolshevik state continued to charge school fees for quite some time. I forgot exactly when they abolished them. It's in my book, but certainly I also read memoirs, people writing how they couldn't, peasant women writing, they couldn't afford to go to school because they had to pay fees. So the bourgeoisie would use this money to pay for school fees. They would also use that to sustain themselves and their families. So that was something that is important. But also we know from the literature on remittances, present day remittances, that it goes beyond material support. People who are plugged in, globally, migrants who work abroad and send money back to their relatives, they also transmit information, and information is important for awareness about the outside world. So I'm also linking this exposure to the capitalist West of this bourgeoisie to their greater sort of information accessibility and access in a way that many less privileged groups did not have. So why should we care? What role for democracy in Russia? What role for social divisions and understanding present day challenges to autocracy? Well, we know from classic literature on the emergence of democracy in Europe that bourgeoisie features very prominently in these debates as a kind of group that favors the extension of franchise. So it's a very well established literature, some classic studies in that field that I cite in my book. But in this literature, we never see Russia featuring other than a country that had a weak or non-existent bourgeoisie and is not relevant for these debates. But the way I approach the bourgeoisie and kind of educated middle class is as an intergenerational category that whose cultural capital, status, and education really matter as a kind of, if we take a much longer term perspective. And that helps us explain the deep social divisions in Russian society that never disappear. The problem we have, and I'm sure that is on a lot of your minds, is what happened to the Soviet modernization project? Didn't the Soviets actually achieve anything? Of course, I'm not denying that. Of course, I'm not denying that they did promote education and they did expand access to universal public schooling. All of these processes of expansion of education, by the way, already happening before the revolution. But essentially, I'm not denying the importance of the Bolshevik modernization project. What I'm saying is that they were these parallel trends. On the one hand, you had this educated bourgeoisie self-reproducing, and you had the Soviet modernization project. We will see what kind of middle classes they produced in a moment. What I'm suggesting is they produced very different kinds of middle class. So first of all, from my analysis, we see that these different groups that if we look at nobility or Mishani, just as examples, we see that they were very heterogeneously distributed across the territory of the present-day Russian Federation. Some regions, including those in the Far East, for instance, had a very high population share of aristocrats. Why? I can go into that. Many were exiled, but established colonies there and lived there for long periods of time. This is according to the 1897 census, by the way. Mishani, also Western reaches, Volga, Far East, high concentration of those groups. By the way, if you want to know, does anybody even know anything about Mishani? Do we know what they look like? Well, this is from those proverbial closets of a professor at Samara University who is researching her ancestry and writes about Mishani. This is her family or her ancestors in the 1920s. So you see how they still look different from Russian peasants. They're not very, you could see that these are not phenomenally rich people on the background, a kind of ramshackle house, but look at the hairstyle. Look at an attempt to appear fashionable. Perhaps she tailored these clothes herself. But there's this very conscious attempt to look like the urban folk, right? Very different images from the peasants. And these are the Polish nobility of one side of that Olenka's son's or the daughter rather family. She married into this. So this is the provincial aristocracy of Polish origin. In any case, so in different regions there was a different distribution of these groups. One caveat I wanted to add is you're probably burning to ask as reviewers of my academic papers, well, what about repressions? Didn't the Soviet state brutally repress people? Didn't it move people across the territory of the realm? So here, one answer to that is to actually analyze the population movements systematically. It's very difficult to do for the Soviet period, but one source I used was genealogical essays of high school students. In Russia, in Samara, there was a competition among high school students, annual competition done by the Historical Society, asking students to write about their ancestry. So I was sent by these civic activists who are historians. They were very open about sending me those essays. And there were over 100 of those. So we tracked together with some colleagues the population movements of those ancestors over the course of the 20th century, actually going back to late 19th century. And you see this cluster, that's for some region of Samara. There's this cluster here, which means that most population movements are actually within the Volga region or within Samara. There are some movements associated with exile and deportation under Stalin, or service in the Second World War, or indeed exile, or just work in, southern parts of the Soviet Empire. But essentially, much of the population movement is very localized. So yes, many people were moved and repressed, but many, many more people. And we have statistics on Stalinist repressions. We forget about the many people who actually stayed in their same regions. And most people, even now, if you look at global statistics, do not move very far from where their parents are. It's hard for us to fathom this. We are kind of all globally intercontinentally connected and constantly moving around, those of us in this room. But the statistic, the reality is the vast majority of the global population do not actually live very far from where their parents or grandparents lived. So let's try to, I hope I still have a couple of minutes. Let's try to make some connections to between this kind of historical patterns of social reproduction and democratic outcomes in post-Soviet Russia. And for now, I'm not touching the latest period of war mobilization, etc. We're just trying to explain why some Russian regions are more open and more democratic than others, because it will give us a sense into a sense of what is it that makes some Russian citizens protest and have more democratic attitudes, and others, not protest, or whether they have those opinions or not, but kind of stay quiet. And so with my co-author Alexander Liebman in our paper in APSR last year, we looked at specifically the Mishani estate as the kind of quintessential bourgeoisie. And we know from classic literature on the role of the middle class and the bourgeoisie that these groups are, because of their perhaps relatively high levels of education, urban living, exposure to different sources of information, also property ownership, experience with owning property and having property rights. You know, there's a whole bundle of issues that makes that makes these groups kind of more or less likely to embrace democracy and rule of law. So if we look at Mishani state, we argue that they have on average higher human capital than the average the population, or as indeed the aristocracy and clergy, but they also had entrepreneurial values. They ran businesses, they owned shops, so they had habitually a greater degree of autonomy that then allowed them to join the modern Soviet professions and join the Soviet educated middle class. And the Soviet system, the Soviet government actually facilitated that in a way because it was desperate to promote modernization agenda, and it worked with the bourgeois professionals. That's a known story of the Soviet kind of volte-face when it comes to their work with this bourgeoisie, which eventually the Bolsheviks stopped tracking the ancestry of these groups religiously, and they simply became Soviet citizens. And so they also adapted in a bottom-up way, and as in transmitting education and knowledge to their children, cultural capital, and all that. So what evidence do we have that these groups, descendants of the old bourgeoisie, are different from the new bourgeoisie, or rather not the bourgeoisie, but the new middle class of Soviet professionals who might have been enjoying phenomenon Soviet class mobility, might have come from humble peasant origins. And pursued higher education. So let's look at the statistic for higher education, for instance. To what extent does it really capture the middle class in the traditional understanding of as a group supporting free media and democracy? So this is Alexander and I, we use the statistics of share of workforce with university degree, recent statistics. And we also had data for press freedom index. Again, this is, like I said, this is for earlier period than the latest sort of one associated with autocracy, but still 1999. And we see that it's not a very good predictor of democracy at the regional level, or freedom, or press freedom and openness. But look at Mishani, the similar analysis for regions, and we see that it's a better predictor of the same outcome of press freedom. So in other words, there's something about this old hereditary bourgeoisie that makes for greater democratic outcomes in Russian regions. This is why we should really heed the information that is given to us by prominent Russian sociologists like Anatoly Vishnevsky, when he writes about the nature of the Soviet urbanization project and the nature of the kind of the Soviet modernization, which stripped of the kind of historical context in which it was occurring, would really give us a very misleading picture. So he writes that by 1990, which is basically a few months before the Soviet Union collapsed, urbanization reached 66% in the Soviet Union. Yet among those aged 60, only 15 to 17% had been born in the city. 40% among those aged 40, and only among those aged 20 and younger, over 50% were native urbanites. They constituted only 37% of the population. By the time of the USSR's collapse, one could not contend that Soviet society became a solidly and overwhelmingly urban society. The USSR citizens in their majority remained urbanites in the first generation, with half to three quarters comprised of urbanites and half or a quarter of peasants. And they bore the stamp of transient status, of marginality. To a certain extent, this stamp will be inherited by their children. And I link these insights, which I think are brilliant and really help us understand, and that was written, about that period immediately preceding the Soviet collapse. But essentially, this remains prescient when we try to understand Russian society now. And I extend this work to and link it with the work by Brain Rosenfeld on the autocratic middle class, that is, which shows that many Russian citizens remain trapped in state-dependent jobs. And often very precarious kind of public sector jobs that are not paid very well, but these jobs leave people vulnerable, so they don't protest against autocracy, and actually they're also socialized in these state-dependent milieus, and they don't have the autonomy really. I like the word autonomy, because when I talk about the hereditary bourgeoisie in very high status professions in Russia, I think they have a lot more autonomy than this state-dependent, which Brain Rosenfeld called autocratic middle class. Why is it autocratic? Because they don't have the resources to mobilize against autocracy, but they're also socialized in a way that helps them identify with the regime that is essentially that provides them with jobs. But I link the precarious status of these individuals with these legacies of the precariat, of rural origin, people who moved from the peasant milieus into cities, but were never given the same opportunities as did the hereditary nobility, clergy, bourgeoisie, who very smoothly progressed into elite Soviet professions. So we have this mass of people, almost 80% of the population, that, by the way, also very rapidly transitioned into urban USSR in a way that was different from Tsarist Russia, where peasant movement into cities was quite slow and gradual because of that Sasovia estate system that actually made it difficult for one to transition from the peasant status to Mishanin or merchant, because you have to have the wealth, you have to own property, etc. Here we have in the Soviet Union massive exodus of peasants to towns because they were fleeing Stalin's brutal collectivization. And when Stalin decided to put a block on this rapid influx of peasants into cities, they trapped them in collective farms without letting these rural groups to move to freedom of movement into cities. They created the system of propiska, residential registration, and peasants or collective farms were also not given passports. So in a way, we see that the Soviet project actually calcified these divisions in Russian society that were there, but were very, very fluid in a way. And in a way, as I show in my discussion of Russian public sphere, civil society, this was changing, and there was a kind of democratic future for Russia. But we see a kind of division that was in some ways more rigidified, although superficially it was obliterated, because we know that the higher education statistics are spectacular. But if you peel off the kind of veneer of those statistics, you see, and I've done that by talking to rural people in Samara region, they will tell you how there was the generation of precarity where their moms and their grandmothers were desperate to escape the kolkhoz, collective farm, but their chances of social improvement was to join urban. They would move to the cities and take teacher training or nursing college degrees, but they were considered not very prestigious. So they were trapped in these low-paid occupations, which were kind of white collar, but essentially the mobility was still in so many ways constrained. So maybe, I don't know how long I've spoken, but I wanted to maybe end with just a quick summary of the contributions. Very much to, I think it's very important for us to take this historical angle on Russian society when we grapple with the nature of autocracy, or indeed apparently weak resistance to it, because I don't think we quite grasp the divisions in social society, which also prevent a common consensus and mobilization against the autocracy, just like of the kind that we see in Ukraine, where Ukrainian citizens who might have had very similar socio-economic divisions, just like every society has, but they're united in a common cause of fighting the imperial aggressor. Russia never had that impulse to unite. Instead, you had this historical division and historical mistrust of the working masses towards this very small, and it remains very, very small, layer of intergenerationally self-reproducing intelligentsia in high status occupation. And it's that small layer of intelligentsia that are meekly trying to challenge the autocracy. But unfortunately, so far at least, and I remain hopeful that this will change, but that is not proving enough to either stop this war or to mount an effective challenge to the autocratic regime. So I'll stop there and
lifting done on the social analysis of the Soviet system, right? Very pretty clear. So let's open up for questions. And I'm sure there will be many, and I have my own as well, but I will wait. And let's start with Daniel.
Well, thank you so much. Such a great presentation. I can read your book. Part of what I really like about what you just laid out first is that you gave us really clear mechanisms for understanding how these legacies reproduced. And when I think about that broader literature, you're connecting it to, you know, there's I would say within that we think sometimes about there being sort of two primary mechanisms, like cognitions, you know, sort of the reproduction of ideas over time and transferred over generations, and then formal institutions. What I came away from your talk was that you have really strong evidence about sort of this transmission in cognitions, like value being transmitted over families. So I have two questions about, and I know you have answers, I'm just curious what they are. So the first one is, to what extent, when you have those cognitions, right, that this layer, this intelligentsia, as they were reproducing, what do you have any sense of how they were making sense of the Soviet regime and transferring information about those values to their children? Sort of how you know those survival strategies or those adaptation strategies, knowing that being forthright could be potentially dangerous, right? And then my second question is, can you speak at all about to what extent there were any formal institutions that were supporting these adaptations? I'm thinking back to the network analysis you showed us earlier on. To what extent did any institutions survive or work to help with that transmission?
Thank you. Should we take more, or you want to answer?
I'll probably answer one by one to do justice to them, and I try to be brief. First of all, great question about the institutional versus cognitional dimension. So on cognitions, I'm very careful, and especially over time, I've become even more careful about claiming that democratic values were being reproduced. So in some ways, perhaps they were. It's very difficult to trace. We don't have survey evidence from before the revolution, or let alone during the Soviet period. My story is about both the institutions that conserved a particular set of kind of status characteristics, but also greater information, greater exposure to information, awareness, and perhaps those democratic values. So what are those institutions? So I talked about the museum society, art galleries, libraries. This is where the aristocrats and the bourgeoisie congregated. They were literally hiding in those places. And so very nice picture about those microdynamics I have from those informers reports and from letters and memoirs about these people who kind of congregated in those spheres of kind of cultural production, right? And in a way, as I was talking about my book to presenting it at AC's conference in America a couple of weeks ago, and one of the discussants, the sociologist Ted Gerber, he said, have you thought about corporatism, that it kind of applies to what you were saying? And I said, oh, actually, that's great. I wish you had suggested that earlier, because corporatism is about how they're kind of a world in themselves. They're really protecting their own interests rather than this big, necessarily public sort of this big goal of democracy, but via a kind of corporate autonomy, we have this kind of link to democracy because autonomy is very important for resisting autocracy. So this autocratic state-dependent middle class that Rosenfeld talks about is not autonomous, right? But the professions are people who run TV Rain. Okay, they're branded foreign agents, but hey, they pack their bags, move their kids to Georgia or Lithuania or whatnot. They have the skills, the language skills, the resources, and the autonomy in a kind of intellectual knowledge sense. So this is the story, both the institutional and perhaps slightly the cognitive, I'm telling. How the formal institutions supported adaptation. Also, I have some analysis of how even the party membership criteria were not as rigid for top scientists in the Soviet Union, which is why so many ended up in the dissident movement. If you look at the biographies of the dissidents, like Andrei Sakharov, first of all, they come from clergy or bourgeoisie or aristocratic backgrounds, if you Google them up. And secondly, they gravitated to these non-ideological professions like the sciences, where party membership criteria were not so rigid. So that also reinforced their independent-mindedness, which is so important in resisting the kind of spin dictatorship type stuff we're seeing now. And compare that with peasants, rural people in rural occupations who do not have even Wi-Fi access, please, not the same, let alone the same kind of information exposure. Yes, please. Can you introduce yourself first?
Yeah, thank you very much indeed, you and Grant. I'm now a journalist covering war. I've been doing that since just before Christmas last year. I was very interested in your point earlier on about left-wing intellectuals in the West and rose-tinted views, because certainly in my school days, my economics teacher, who was an LSE graduate, his professor was a former assassin in Sarajevo in 1914. He certainly gave us a very rose-tinted view of the Soviet Union. He was pushing it. But my question, I think you partially answered it actually when you mentioned Sakharov. Where did the technical skills and experience and corporatism, which saved the day in 1941 to 43, where did that come from?
You mean the actual, it's the expertise that
the generals, the engineers, the people who built the tanks and the artillery and the aircraft. So just enough to hold on.
So we know that during the war, especially even before that, there was a relaxation of the witch hunts and the class sort of vigilance. But certainly during the war, there was more of that because of the instrumental rationale to fight the Nazi Germany. And so there are, for instance, memoirs of Sergei Golitsyn, who's from a famous, prominent aristocratic family. He served as a soldier in the war, and he describes how his aristocratic pedigree didn't prevent the regime from using him as, I forgot it, I think he was a topographer, or, he had a relatively sort of kind of, I don't know if the word intellectual, but certainly high-skilled. He used his skills during the war on the kind of battlefront, and so there was less of that, and actually we do, on the other hand, have other statistics of the Gulag expanding during the war because so many men were sent to fight in the war, and somebody needed to take care of the industry and the economy. So many more women, including women of those kind of suspect groups, were sent into the Gulag camp as slave laborers, basically. So we have memoirs of individuals from that kind of discussing that phenomenon as well. So the picture is very complex. There was repression as well, but both repression and kind of relaxation of class witch hunts had a kind of very instrumental damage, delivering the war effort and victory for the Soviet Union. So the Bolsheviks never shied away from instrumentalizing and using this skilled professionals because industrial development took paramount importance over class vigilance, although of course they would not admit that.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
I'm Bourgeoisie, I'm a journalist, but I found it very, very interesting, and it absolutely rings true. But I wondered whether you talked at all in your book about what happened through the end of the Soviet Union, the Soviet collapse, because I was reporting from the Soviet Union and ex-Soviet Union at the time. And one of the things that I noticed was how quickly the bourgeois elements came back into the open as though they'd just been camouflaged for all that time. And you could see that I was astonished by the return of very bourgeois manners, the way people talked at suddenly were talking about господин so-and-so rather than tavarish or rather than nothing. Manners of young men who'd obviously been taught by their families how to behave, but they hadn't behaved like that until suddenly it became acceptable again. People reverted to old style names. So people were instead of being called Svetlana and Vladimir, they'd be being called Victoria, Anastasia, Vladislav, all sort of older names, middle class names were coming back. And a sort of sense of style came back because there was choice in people, that it was okay, you didn't have to camouflage yourself anymore. So I just wondered whether you have that at all.
This is really interesting. I mean, it just and I'm very curious about your hearing your experience of that period, because certainly it corroborates the story that we are also finding with some of the other analysis I didn't have time to discuss. For instance, so my co-author, Alexander Liebman, he's an economist who's just brilliant guy, and he always comes up with interesting data. So he found this data on speculation, convictions for speculation in the Soviet period, right? Apparently the KGB held, gathered statistics by region and on, how many people were convicted. And we found that regions that had a higher share of the bourgeoisie in the imperial period also kind of correlates nicely with those speculation convictions, which suggests that people were using the kind of underground shadow economy, which we know in the Soviet Union continued to exist, right? And then when Gorbachev allowed cooperative movement, allowed private enterprise, they simply emerged from the shadows in a way that never disappeared. The people were renting out privately properties or rooms in their homes, all that stuff. People were doing musical gigs and collecting cash, The market really didn't disappear, but what you say also about the return of aristocratic names, again, very much supported by memoirs of, like, for instance, Golitsyn. I also know the story of Golitsyn because one of my dad's, friends or contacts married into that family, and so I know what the Moors are and how they really cherished their aristocratic heritage. The awareness of their pedigree never disappeared, even for people who never emigrated, who stayed on in the Soviet Union. Very much, I think, part of the story. And I also, by the way, I urge in my book for us to stop dating the start of the Soviet period from 1917. It's misleading. Start dating it from 1928. The end of NEP, when they started destroying churches, started collectivization, 1928 to 1986, Gorbachev reforms. Very short period, barely one generation, barely two generations.
Thank you, Tomila. Anne-Marie?
Good evening, my name is Anna Maria. I'm a PhD student at Russian Institute. Thank you so much for the presentation. I haven't had the chance yet to read your book, and I will probably have a very PhD student's kind of question. Because I gathered from bits and bobs, but I don't have the full picture, and you added to it just now. So I'm wondering how your data collection looked like over the period of these 7 years, and also you mentioned a lot of memoirs. Yes, because you mentioned a lot of memoirs and some archival work. So I'm wondering what was your experience as well, and what kind of amount of data, right, you are looking at. As well as a related question of because you mentioned network analysis and we have seen it on the slide, but what textual analysis you probably used on it, whether you have considered genealogy or not, because it sounds like it's something overarching period with archival work, so it sounds very much genealogy to me. And a second half question relating to that, again, also because 2022 has changed a lot in terms of what can be done. If I can push you to this mental gymnastics of given the renewed war and what is now possible and not possible to do in Russia in terms of research, if you can think of how you would have done if you would have started now. So access to archives, obviously not a thing anymore, even if you have a Russian passport, because it's about a special access to it. So if what would be your recommendation, or what you would do if you would start now?
So really great set of questions. And for PhD students especially, I highly recommend checking out that post-Soviet affairs. It's going to be a double special issue on the future of Russian studies after the war. Some really good top specialists contributing to how is the exogenous shock of the war going to affect Russian studies. And, you know, I'm contributing Gulnaz also, Vladimir Gelman, Bryn Rosenfeld, Ted Gerber, really big names in the field. Okay, in terms of the data, and when I say messy, it really was messy. And my advice is keep your eyes open, keep your antenna open to serendipity. So actually, my curiosity about the Russian estates started when I was a PhD student at Oxford, and you know, back then we didn't have open access stuff. So in the Bodleian Library, I would see that there's a card for this interesting census, 1897 census on Russian Empire, and I was curious about seeing it. And it was actually an aggregate, just one volume, aggregate statistics for regions. And I saw these statistics on Mishani and all those, you know, group, and I realized, oh, that's interesting data. But that was many, many years ago. And it took me so long to actually bring this to fruition. I started off with very, very simplistic statistics, which would be very embarrassing. No journal would publish that kind of basic analysis I did. But same with the social network analysis. I started off by just drawing, you know, okay, this is the connection, this Antonina Hard, and she knows this person. I was drawing stuff, and then I realized, oh my God, all these people are intermarried, they're cousins, they're related. The picture was becoming so complicated, and then I started creating a formal Excel spreadsheet, and I found this yearbook for Samara. It's a bit like Yellow Pages, where all the individuals are listed in the public sphere with their you know, estate and affiliations. So it was a very slow process. In terms of working with historians, the advantage we have as political scientists is that the requirements of how we work with historical records are not as rigid as those for historians. Historians, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, if you are historians, I think have to go and physically sit in the archive. What I did, and that's the good news for you, is so much of historical material is available on 3 PDFs online. If you search stuff, a lot of regional historians are actually just finding interesting materials in the archives and then just dumping them on the internet. Lots of stuff is available now, including a lot of statistics. The problem for me and for future scholarship on Russia is we cannot anymore work with Russian co-authors and historians who helped us gather that data. So I collaborated with Russian academics for whom it simply became dangerous to collaborate with us. And that is a big problem. And actually, they were doing, I think, regional historians, and that's a point I make in my contribution to the post-Soviet affairs paper. They often are not cited, their work is not acknowledged by prominent Western scholars, but they're producing really amazing work, which they publish in obscure journals that are often on open access. So if you read Russian, read those obscure journals, because actually the stuff there is more interesting than a lot of the stuff that appears in, you know, fancy, schmancy political science outlets.
Thank you, Tomila. Okay, please.
Hi, Professor. I really like the thesis of the book and the statistics. I found it really convincing. I'm wondering though, so we're taking the basically critique, I don't speak Russian, sorry. And we're seeing how that impacts that freedom index, freedom of the press index right now. Are we taking into account, and is it something we should take into account? Are there a sizable portion of the population, those kind of Soviet intellectuals, quote unquote, that basically came from nothing and then became, I don't know, literary man or scientist. And I'm thinking that that's where the question stems from. Joseph Brodsky, that's the right pronunciation. Like, was it a big enough sense of the population to account statistically for it? Does it have an impact?
Mhm. So, really good question. So, the analysis we do statistically is probabilistic analysis, and in the chapter 9 of the book, I make it clear that it's probabilistic, and I'm not denying that there were lots of intermarriages. There was indeed social mobility, but when we talk, those of us who've done statistical analysis know that it's really about saying that the probability of a region that had a high share of Mishani to have more free media now is higher than that of a region where the share of Mishani was low and maybe the share of the rural population was higher. And there's a lot of other factors at work, not least because the Bolsheviks actually channeled resources to regions that were already more developed. So it's a top-down and bottom-up story. And those regions that were more developed also, yes, they had rural individuals from rural backgrounds who enjoyed social mobility, but there were also greater opportunities for social mobility because there were so many bourgeois intellectuals who taught in the regional universities. And a lot of those institutions were established before the revolution. So Samara University is an interesting example. And Kazan, I think you come from Kazan, right? Kazan is like, it was the creme de la creme, right? In Imperial Russia, this is what the Lithuanians study in Kazan or had some connection. So Kazan, those regional universities had a very long pedigree from before the revolution. The Bolsheviks simply attached the label Soviet to those institutions. But they were already there, and a lot of the same academics who worked there stayed on and taught until the 1960s, and then of course the next generation. So I'm not denying that there was this other channel of social mobility, but it's the probabilities that we're talking about. Yeah.
Thank you for your time. I was curious about the book. If you discussed the role of Orthodox Church in this social mobility and constrict, as you said, calcifying the distressful democracy in Russian population. For example, now we see Patriarch Kirill in his collaboration with Putin and saying that the Ukraine war was a holy war. And also, even with Stalin, when religion was really a big factor, we still saw peasantry having icons growing like Stalin. So, to what extent do you think?
I'm glad you brought up this question. I approach this from a different angle. Again, so the statistics I use for the Tsarist period are from the 1897 census. So it started with this small book with aggregate, and then I gathered, massive district level. So basically hundreds of districts that correspond to, rayone level in present day Russia. So with matching districts was difficult, but and that census, 1897 census, was the major census that was ever historically conducted across the territory of Russia. And of course, then the Bolsheviks came to power in 1917. And so this remains, 1897 remains the major census. What is fascinating about that data, and it's very, very sad, and I'm sad to say this, but individuals who identified as Orthodox Christians had lower literacy on average than the Jews, than the Protestants, than the Catholics, and the Muslims in many cases. And the Muslim population actually had very high education statistics because of there was a whole movement, the Jadidi, I think intellectuals they were called, and the Muslim clergy were really obsessed about education in the Soviet period as well. I have a quote in my book how they bring certificates to the local Soviets saying they come from peasant background, but actually they were sons and daughters of mullahs, which is the Muslim clergy. So, but that is the sad reality that the Orthodox Church affiliation was not very conducive to the development of literacy among the population that it controlled. And I think that, so that's why the big story I'm telling is really a story of education. And that's why I'm emphasizing that a lot of the democratic impulse comes in the regions I looked at from these very eclectic groups, culturally, socially, the Poles, the Polish exiles, the Tatars, the Tatar intellectuals and clergy, the Jews, the Germans, German settlers settled in the under Catherine the Great in the Volga region. And of course, that diffused to the Orthodox populations as well. But the story is really very much one of where this impulse for education and enlightenment was kind of did not really originate with the Orthodox Church. And so in a way, it's not surprising now the historical position of the church essentially repeating itself in, as a kind of allied with the state, but not necessarily one about enlightenment or promoting civic virtues, like when we think about the Protestantism and the kind of values of education that are instilled, with child literacy, etc. So this is the angle I would take and this is informed by my familiarity with the census statistics.
All right, I think it's almost 7 o'clock, and please join me in thanking Tomila for one.